In this episode, we'll be looking at one of the most enigmatic characters in this saga, a young man named Jack Parsons.
Jack Parsons was a brilliant chemist and scientist who was obsessed with space and getting the human race into space. He wanted to build rockets. He was associated with people like Robert Goddard. He did some of the first research and very successful designs of solid rocket motors. Back in the 1930s, before there was the formation of anything like JPL or any of the other organizations that eventually worked on rockets, there was a big debate whether you would go with a liquid-fueled rocket or a solid-fueled rocket. Now, solid-fueled rockets had a lot of issues. Jack Parsons is the guy who figured out how to make solid rocket motors work.
Jack Parsons was a rocket propulsion genius who was instrumental, along with Theodore Carman and a few other people, in founding the Jet Propulsion Lab in Pasadena.
Jack Parsons was the inventor of JATO, and it's a jet-assisted lifting engine that we use on the military airplanes. And from there, he actually formed and founded JPL. And a lot of his inventions are responsible for the Apollo mission success in the 1950s.
He mixed together the solid rocket fuel with asphalt and created the current cylinder-burning solid rocket motors that we have today.
And he helped his colleagues, known as the Suicide Squad, because they were always blowing stuff up. He helps his colleagues form Aerojet Corporation. I mean, this guy was brilliant, absolutely brilliant, and considered the most brilliant of all the Rocketeers by his mentor, Theodore von Karman. Theodore von Karman was the first guy to win the National Science Award, awarded by President Kennedy. Karman was a very influential person in American science in general, but specifically in aviation technology, in rocketry, in missiles, and all that sort of stuff, and was also consulted frequently by the Air Force on the subject of UFOs. And von Karman believed that he was a descendant of Rabbi Loew of Prague, the guy who created the golem, you know, the very first sort of Frankenstein's monster. So we have this strange constellation of very eccentric people who are also very brilliant.
Now, the dark side of Jack Parsons that most people don't know about is that he was also an occultist. He was very, very closely associated with Aleister Crowley. In fact, at one time, he was the number 2 man in the Ordo Templi Orientis, which was Crowley's organization here in the United States.
One of Parsons' buddies was a fellow by the name of L. Ron Hubbard, who accompanied Parsons during some of these rituals that Parsons said were a success, and Hubbard was there. Hubbard, a few years later, supposedly on a $5 bar bet, creates the religion of Scientology.
I mean, we have a lot of eccentric people here, conducting magical rituals one day, hobnobbing with science fiction writers another day, and going back to work for the space program.
The Scientologists, for their part in it, say that L. Ron Hubbard was actually working for the Office of Naval Intelligence, that he went to the mansion in Pasadena to infiltrate this cult of black magic worshipers, and that his purpose was to create chaos, disruption, and break it up. Now, I've been to the offices of the Church of Scientology. I've been shown documents, I've been given these documents that indicate that I think it's very likely that Hubbard was still attached to the Office of Naval Intelligence when he was operating at Jack Parsons' mansion. And I think when you look at it, there's absolutely no question about the fact that he did disrupt the operations. He did expose a lot of these scientists as occultists. And in the end, he kind of blew the whole thing up because the OTO fell apart after Hubbard and Parsons had their feud. So if he was in fact working for the Office of Naval Intelligence, he certainly accomplished his task. And there are various different documents that show that at the time he was actually at Parsons' mansion, according to the official documents, he was in a hospital in San Francisco, where he actually never was.
While Jack Parsons' genius was undeniably valued in his professional life, it was his eccentric and turbid personal life that, in the end, proved fatal.
He lost his security clearances because of all the weird stuff he was involved in. Basically, the US government decided that even though he was a brilliant scientist, he was an unreliable character, and they kicked him out of high-level rocketry research. So what he began to do is begin to work for other countries and other governments that wanted to develop rocket capabilities.
And Parsons has already gotten a job offer from the Israeli government. The Israelis want him to develop rocket technology for them. Now, Israel was not an enemy of the United States, so it wasn't a treasonous thing, but they came up with some charge. They dropped the charges against him, but they still took his security clearance away. That arrangement with Israel was started by Theodor von Karman. Once again, our very helpful, annoyingly helpful Theodor von Karman is the guy who puts Parsons together with the Israelis. He goes into his lab, which was his house there in Pasadena, and according to the story, he dropped a vial of fulminate of mercury, which is extremely volatile. He drops it and boom, the whole place goes up, and there's more explosives in the lab. The thing becomes a fireball, end of Jack Parsons, who actually survived it for a few minutes, but didn't make it to the hospital.
I mean, they blew him up. I mean, you can't write this stuff.
There are a couple of possibilities with Parsons' death. Some people say that he was assassinated because they say it's very unlikely he would have been careless with a beaker of fuel and set himself on fire. I mean, certainly he'd been doing experiments at that point for 20 years, more than 20 years. He'd never had any kind of a major accident. So it's very unlikely that he made a mistake and burned himself to death. So the alternative is that they didn't want him working with the Israelis, or that somebody in the high levels of government thought he was a threat to U.S. national security and wanted to wipe him out. So they started the fire, it killed him along with, the garage and all the material he had there. But the other possibility that's been raised is that his death was actually faked, because nobody really knows where his body is. Nobody's really sure where he's buried. Nobody's ever done a post-mortem on him to determine that this is in fact the body of Jack Parsons. In fact, as far as I know, there was no identification of the body other than, well, who else would be in here and burned to death in Jack Parsons' laboratory?
It's quite possible that Jack Parsons was assassinated, because it's really hard to believe that a man of his intelligence, who had already been very familiar with the different types of chemicals and experiments, can be in his own garage working on a hobby and then all of a sudden explode. It just doesn't make any sense. Another option could be that he actually faked his death. I mean, the guy was very, very brilliant. So there's another possibility, a question mark you always have to think about. Did he fake his death and was taken into the secret space program, where he can actually help the secret space program progress with further technologies that he was working on, maybe in black operations?
Nobody wanted Jack Parsons, who had genius stuff going on in his brain, who knew how to build rockets better than anybody else in the world. Nobody wanted him to leave the country. He was a walking security risk. He just knew too much. So it's possible that he was eliminated right then and there.
So I think there was definitely an intelligence game that was being played on Parsons, and they were trying to find out not just about Parsons, but who else was involved at JPL and who else was involved at various defense contractors that were working on classified programs that may have been involved in his cult. Because remember, at that time, we were just coming off of the UFO sightings, we had the Roswell crash, we had the Kenneth Arnold incident, and then there was the whole period where we got buzzed in the Capitol by either the Germans or the ETs, nobody really knows for sure, and they were beginning to develop this anti-gravity technology. Now, it's logical that the same brilliant minds that worked on the chemical rockets would work on the next step in the technological chain, which would be an anti-gravity device, an anti-gravity flying saucer, maybe something based along the German Hannabaus, or something that was developed completely different, having to do with reverse engineered ET technology, or based on some of T. Townsend Brown's designs. So when I look at this pattern, I see that they would have probably tried to weed out the bad apples before they cleared them to work on these super secret, super highly advanced technologies. Because chemical rockets are one thing, but if you have flying saucers that are based on anti-gravity effects, have force field capabilities, inertial dampening fields, and probably don't operate on gasoline or oil, that's world-changing technology, and you can't have that kind of stuff getting into the wrong hands. You have capabilities there of creating weapons that could destroy worlds.
This is going on under the aegis of the military-industrial complex. These are all programs that were approved and paid for by our government, by the military. Until finally, in the 50s, at least the 50s, we're talking about von Karman and Parsons and all those people. Parsons loses his security clearance. Another member of the Suicide Squad, Frank Molina, his close friend, loses his security clearance. Their co-worker, H.S. Tian, the brilliant Chinese engineer, accused completely unfairly of being a communist, loses his security clearance. Everybody who helped develop our space program from California, the people who invented the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, who founded it, all lost their security clearances, never worked again. But they were replaced by the paperclip scientists. So now we're bringing in Wernher von Braun, we're bringing in Hermann Oberth, on and on and on. We're bringing in all these Nazi scientists, people who were our enemies, people that we know should never have a security clearance, people who fought against us in World War II, developed the weapons of mass destruction that Hitler used. We got those guys and brought them to the United States, and we fired the guys who helped our space program, claiming they were kind of lefty. Doesn't matter, they're out of here. They're just too eccentric.
Not only did NASA have some early pioneers who were interested in the occult, but we've also seen that the very origins of NASA itself have a large German component via Operation Paperclip. That leaves this question begging for an answer. What is NASA?
Well, I think NASA was a front that was created to basically sideline many scientists, engineers, the general public from the possibilities of anti-gravity. If you look at the 1950s, which is the critical phase in terms of the study of anti-gravity, you see that there were a number of journals, especially in Britain, that released peer-reviewed papers. Anti-gravity was being studied in aviation journals. You had a number of companies. We know the Douglas Aircraft Company was doing extensive studies on anti-gravity. And these were showing that it was feasible and that this is something that could be used for generating aerospace vehicles, flying saucers. So then what happens is you have NASA kind of being formed at the end of the Eisenhower administration. And NASA basically is focused on space exploration using conventional rocket propulsion. And some of the chief NASA scientists leading these projects were Project Paperclip personnel. These were former Nazis, like for example Wernher von Braun. He was the head of the Redstone Army Arsenal for missile technology, and when NASA was formed, he was instantly transferred over to being the director of the Marshall Space Flight Center out of Huntsville, Alabama. You had Kurt Debus, another Nazi scientist, former SS officer, being the head of the space program out of NASA Florida Center there, Kennedy Space Center. The whole NASA program was a misdirection from the feasibility of anti-gravity, which was being secretly studied in black projects by companies such as Douglas and Northrop Grumman and Lockheed and others for the military, for the Army, US Air Force, for the US Navy, that were all trying to get these companies to build anti-gravity vehicles for them, but were not going to be released to the public for national security reasons and because of the power of the oil lobby.
In January 27, 1967, NASA astronauts Virgil Grissom, Edward White, and Roger Chaffee were performing a launch simulation when a fire broke out in their module. This incident and the ensuing investigation would be one of the many proving the space agency deserved its frequently used moniker in the truth community: never a straight answer.
In Apollo 1, Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee were actually going to do a full-on test of the Apollo 1 capsule. They actually went up into the capsule, and while they were in there, they were locked and sealed in. Within a few minutes, all of a sudden, unexplicably, they lost communication with the command center. Now this is very bizarre because there's 3 forms of communication and all 3 went out. So you can imagine the horror probably on these guys' faces when they realized they couldn't get any communication whatsoever and they were locked in the capsule.
The Apollo 1 fire is still kind of a mystery to this day. There were issues with the Apollo design. The astronauts had complained about a lot of stuff. They complained that they were testing in a 100% pure oxygen environment, which is very, very flammable. There was way too much Velcro and items on the spacecraft that could have burned. And lo and behold, when they did this high pressure test on Apollo 1, there was some sort of spark, which to this day, nobody really knows what sparked, which caused a fire that burned very, very quickly and killed the astronauts, burned them to death, suffocated them in the smoke in just minutes before they could even get the hatch back open.
Now, before that happened, Gus Grissom was noted as saying that someone's gonna die. And he was being very critical of the NASA space program.
But what's interesting about the Apollo 1 fire is that it happened at a time when there's certain stellar alignments right above the landing site, which have been shown repeatedly to be an homage to ancient Egyptian gods like Isis and Osiris. In this case, it was Orion's belt, 33 degrees above the launch pad at the time. And on board was Gus Grissom. Gus Grissom was supposed to be the first man to walk on the moon, not Neil Armstrong. He was one of the original Mercury 7 astronauts, and he had made a lot of complaints about the fact that, you know, as far as he was concerned, he was just spamming a cam in his crappy Apollo program, and he knew very well that we had already been to the moon and Mars, and he told people this, that we have much more highly advanced spacecraft that have traveled to the moon and traveled to Mars, and, you know, we're just basically crash test dummies. And he had lamented that, he criticized NASA, and it seems to be kind of a convenient coincidence that a guy that had a reputation as a maverick, as a free thinker, as a guy who would say what was on his mind and didn't have a great filter, was one of the 3 men who was killed that day. And in fact, it got so bad, he was complaining so much about what was wrong with the spacecraft that he actually hung a lemon on the Apollo 1 capsule at one point.
Thomas Barron was a safety inspector in NASA. He was only there for about 16 months total, and he's viewed as one of the kind of early whistleblower type of people. He was extremely compulsive, I think is a safe word, about reporting every single detail of anything that was wrong inside NASA with regard to safety, with regard to attitudes, with regard to employment policies. He wrote this big 50-page report about this, and he sent the report in officially, and it was suppressed, and he got really upset about this, and so he leaked a copy of this report to a journalist who then publicized it. And because of the reaction on the part of NASA turning in this ad hominem attack against him, criticizing him and trying to counter the arguments he was making, many of which were valid. What made this so important is that his report preceded this terrible, tragic fire. And so people began to kind of put the two together, that maybe if people had listened to all of his complaints, this terrible tragedy wouldn't have happened.
That there were many, many inefficiencies in the design and the manufacture of the Apollo 1 craft, that there were many mistakes that had been made, there were all kinds of problems with it that weren't being addressed, and then when people went up the chain of command and said, hey, this thing is not going to work, it's not going to fly, it's got major issues, they were told basically to shut up and do their job. Just a day or two after he testified before Congress and gave this very, very critical testimony, it turns out he gets killed along with his entire family in a train collision with his car.
I believe he got hit driving across a train crossing and was hit by the train. I've never been asked to investigate it. I've never been brought in with any of my team to look at that. We have capacities to do investigations like that.
It just seems really convenient because that line of criticism basically was quashed from that point forward.
Even though he had already went on several space flights and was a national hero. So there's definitely something going on there behind the scenes, because even Gus Grissom's family, for many, many years after, had contacted NASA and really wanted to get answers as to exactly what happened, and they never did. They never got clarification, they never got closure. And the actual capsule itself is still sitting in a military bunker somewhere, sealed off, and nobody can get access to it.
Why were so many red flags in this mission ignored? And is it possible that this was much more than a simple accident? What was NASA trying to hide?
I follow NASA very closely. I'm getting their feeds in various ways. NASA tells you things without telling you things. If you don't pay attention to NASA, you're going to think that NASA is hiding a lot. But they're not actually, they're kind of talking about it. And these days, they're bringing their cameras in all over the place, into the desert installations and everything else. They're kind of openly discussing things, discussing aircraft they developed 20, 30 years ago that are still operational, discussing weird cameras they invented, which from space can identify something as small as a foot long. And they've had this for a while. We think in terms of this is like, modern stuff. They've had this for decades. They're bragging about it, they're boasting of it. So can we trust NASA? I don't know if trust is the right word. We have to keep an eye on them. They haven't seemed to be hiding anything, but then maybe we're not asking the right questions. There was a point when we were having a discussion with somebody high up in the US government who said part of the problem with disclosure and the whole hullabaloo around it is that people are not asking the right questions. They're not asking the right questions because they kind of think they already know the answers. And that is causing a problem because they can't answer those questions. But if you learn to ask the right questions, you might get answers that will surprise you. And I think we have to take a different approach to NASA and to the military-industrial complex. And that is to take a less adversarial position regarding the government. We have an adversarial position, and I understand why. Especially the UFO community really understands why there should be adversarial. There's been a lot of nonsense and a lot of deliberate lying by the government and disinformation agents. The Doty-Benowitz case is famous for this. And that's the ultimate example of people screwing with you from the government. Why? There's no reason that we can see why they would go to that extent. You don't want to tell us, don't tell us. You want to say it's classified, it's classified. You want to say, I don't have a clue, say I don't have a clue. But don't screw with us. Don't say, we're going to show you maybe something that you should, no, maybe not. No, we have a video, maybe not. We have these documents, you can look at them now, but you can't see them later. This kind of stuff, what does it accomplish, right? So we know they've screwed with us. But a lot of that was Cold War era doing, not all of it. And they had a lot of nuclear weapons, so I can understand the nervousness and maybe the disinformation from the government where this is concerned. We have to believe that they have our best interests at heart, at least in terms of physical security. Mental security, not so much. And there's a lot of very decent, very hardworking, very well-intentioned people working in the military and in intelligence agencies, obviously. So that aside, we're now living in a different era. This is no longer the Cold War. Yes, we still have enemies. Yes, Russia may still be a problem. China may be a problem, and so on and so forth. But when it comes to the phenomenon, stop screwing with us. We have to take a less adversarial relationship because we've not been getting any flies with vinegar. Maybe there's a honey approach we can use. Let's talk to them nicely. What about this? Ask about something specific. Ask the right question. See what kind of an answer you get. Find the right people to ask as well. Don't think that there's one big box of UFO secrets buried somewhere, and there's like 10 guys standing around it with their arms closed, and that they have the secrets. Sometimes if it's compartmented, it could be scattered throughout the entire military-industrial complex. So there could be a situation where people have a piece of the puzzle, they don't have all of it, because it's on need to know. Don't talk to them about aliens up front. Be careful about that, but talk to them about what really happened with this crash or that crash. Work your way into it, do it gently, and see what you get, because we've been surprised, I've been surprised at sometimes the responses you get and the guidance and the kind of, well, did you think about this? And then they walk away, you know, without actually saying anything. But it gets you going in a direction, and sometimes you uncover things that you didn't expect to find. And I think that the adversarial position we've taken all this time hasn't really resulted in very much. So, like I always say to them, how's that working out for you? You know, it's not working, so let's try a different way.
In December 1960, a NASA-commissioned report was released to the public, called the Brookings Report because it was researched and authored by the Brookings Institution. The Brookings Report asked the big question: what would happen to our planet, our beliefs, and our way of life if NASA discovered extraterrestrial life, or even just extraterrestrial artifacts? Their answer may surprise you.
The Brookings Report was right next door to our office at the Jesuit National Headquarters in Washington, D.C. That in 1960, they were asked to do a confidential report to determine what effect the discovery of extraterrestrial intelligence, highly technologically developed intelligence, would have on the American people in global politics and the economy, et cetera. And the Brookings Institution, just barely left of center, kind of liberal organization, actually came up with the fundamental conclusion that it would be probably better to keep it secret. If we were to discover that there was such a civilization, because it would be too disruptive to the United States, and that it would disequilibrium in the economy, it would destabilize the political order, and they went on and on about that.
One of the most important things about the Brookings Report, written in the 1960s, is the section that says the implications of the existence of extraterrestrial life. And in this particular part of the report, it states that if the general population were to actually find out about extraterrestrial life, it could break down the economy, it could put people into a panic, and it could destroy the control system that's already been in place by many governments around the world.
Well, the Brookings Report was something that was commissioned, with the Brookings Institute playing this role of generating the report and then releasing it to NASA and to the Congress, US Congress. And so the Brookings report really identified a number of things that were critical in terms of understanding the impact of any discovery of extraterrestrial life. There were some kind of scenarios that suggested that, well, this could be a repeat of what happened with the conquest of the Americas, where you could understand the impact of a more technologically developed society upon a less technologically developed society, culminated in the disintegration of many American societies during the Spanish conquest. So it was hypothesized that the extraterrestrials could view us similarly as a less technologically developed society and basically come in and impose their own value systems, and that would be a direct threat to the sovereignty of the United States. So that was a major concern. They identified a number of things that would be important in this kind of announcement, and the one that I found most intriguing was that of the groups that would be most likely to be severely impacted by disclosure of the existence of extraterrestrial life was the scientific community, because many of these scientists really embrace a number of scientific laws as being foundational for life, not only on Earth, but possible life throughout the universe, and that these were universal laws. And to have extraterrestrials sharing more advanced principles of physics, life sciences, that this would be something that would be tremendously damaging to the morale of many scientists. And so that was the community that the Brookings report identified as most likely to suffer the most severe impact of this kind of announcement. And so, you have the scenario of many scientists, entering into some kind of mental depression because all of a sudden they find out that their cherished laws of physics are not inviolable as they thought previously.
There's no doubt that NASA is going to be subject to the same type of military secrecy that obtains in all other programs the United States government has. And there are numerous incidents of video cameras in NASA missions picking up visual evidence of potential other beings and craft around. For example, UFOs in the national security state, that Richard Dolan has shown the documented evidence that the United States military was under clear instructions to suppress and conceal any information that would indicate that there was an extraterrestrial civilization. And so that type of secrecy would spill over into NASA. And there's no doubt, therefore, that they have concealed any data of that kind that they would have come into contact with.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
NASA can be trusted to do what it was created to do, in fact. The problem with the lack of trust in the part of the American people in NASA is that NASA was sold as this very romantic space exploration, Star Trek, you reach out where no man has gone before and explore space, and engaged a very real level of enthusiasm on the part of the American people. But in fact, behind the scenes, it was really designed to be a military program that was established to try to establish U.S. military hegemony in the high frontier, to take control of high space and get our satellites up and be able to engage in a special additional dimension of warfare. Now, fortunately, they've refrained from laying claim to the moon or trying to lay claim to Mars. Fortunately, the romantic aspect of NASA has had a tempering effect upon the kind of military objectives that it's had. And so there's this existential process that is going on of trying to determine which of these elements is going to ultimately lay claim to NASA in the future. I'm hoping, and I always have hoped ever since I wanted to be an astronaut when I was back in high school, that the more romantic and peaceful objectives of NASA can rise to the ascendancy. That's what I'm hoping that I can play some role in helping that happen.
Ezekiel writes that of a sudden they hear the noise in the sky. All the slaves look up there. Then he sees an object coming down from the sky. Then he realizes that the object makes a tremendous noise. He compares the noise with the thundering of a waterfall, or he compares it with fighting wagons. So a terrible noise this object made. All the slaves looking there, the object comes down, sand is blown up. Ezekiel is high priest by profession, so he believes in the beginning it must be God. He felt on his nose to pray to the Lord. And then he realized this is not God. And then he describes exactly what he sees. He describes not only the noise, he describes the wings. The wings moved. When the wings moved, that the tremendous noise started to be there again. When the wings stood still, they were hanging down. He describes the leg. He clearly says the leg were out of metal. Then he cries the wheel, and the wheel shocked him totally, because the wheel of his times can go forward and backward. But the wheel which he sees here, they go also forward and backward, but at the same time, left and right, without making a steering movement. You see, when you are sitting in your car today, and you want to make a curve, you make on your wheel a curve, a steering movement, and the wheels are turning now that you come in your curve. Ezekiel sees a wheel which goes forward, backward, right and left without making a steering movement. This shocks him so he cannot understand it. He describes it 4 times. Some 30 years ago, I had a secret speech at the headquarters at NASA in Huntsville, in the United States. Secret, why secret? Because both parties agreed not to go to public. I did not say a word at that time, and the other part not. And on this speak, I also talk about 5 minutes about Ezekiel. And after the speech, we had a dinner together, and there was the chief of the Department of Construction, an ex-German, his name was Joseph Brumrich, who came to me and said, that was very interesting, but Mr. von Daniken, in the Bible, you will never find technology. The Bible, this is imagination. These are dreamings. These are wishes. These are visions, but not technology. Anyhow, he said, I was the first one who brought him up to Ezekiel. He never read Ezekiel before. Now he will do it. He started to read Ezekiel, and finally he realized that whatever Ezekiel described is real. They have it on their design desk today. And he started to reconstruct Ezekiel's description. The outcome was a book with the English title, The Spaceship of Ezekiel. And in the foreword of it, Mr. Joe Blumrich, the ex-chief of the construction department at NASA, said, I absolutely started this work to disprove Erich von Daniken's story of Ezekiel. But it was absolutely sensational what comes out. Ezekiel did saw an extraterrestrial spacecraft. Now, Ezekiel's spaceship is not a mother spaceship with which you can move from star to star. Ezekiel's spaceship is only an object which today we would call space shuttle. You have to have a mother spaceship, and from the mother spaceship, a smaller vehicle comes down to the Earth. So that's what it was. Now, Ezekiel describes, I think it's up to chapter 40 or so, that the splendorness of God. Yes, by the way, this is very important. I knew the original Ezekiel. I read it first in Hebrew. I did not learn specially Hebrew, but we had a Latin translation. And in the original Ezekiel, the word God never appears, never. Ezekiel says it was the splendorness of the highest. The word God in the Bible only comes in later by the translators. The translator, the splendor of the highest, he means God. In the original, the word God is never mentioned. So, in theology, they say, well, Ezekiel had a vision. He saw God sitting on his flying chariot. As I said before, for me, God does not need a flying chariot. Now, anyhow, he continues in the book of Ezekiel and he says that the splendorness of the highest arrived a second time. And this time, the hand of the highest put him on the throne. In my view, he was sitting in the co-pilot's chair. And then he describes how they started. He says, and the hand of the highest pressed upon my chest because he feels the gravity when starting. He does not know where the trip goes because he says, they brought me on a very, very high mountain. He clearly says, very, very, not just very high mountain, no high mountain, very, very high mountain. He doesn't know where he is. He looks down and he sees under him something like a city, a small city or a big village. And in the center of it, something like a temple. Now the word temple again, we had to analyze. What was a temple for our forefathers? A temple was a place where the gods were living. Later, we made temples, churches, in believing that now God will come into there, but in the original time. So, he saw something like a temple in this big village or small city. He is sitting himself in the splendorness of the God on the co-pilot seat. The splendorness of the Lord comes to a standstill over the temple. Slowly, slowly, he sinks inside the so-called temple. And Ezekiel realized at that moment that the noise of the wings were this time higher and louder than what he had heard before in the desert, because now the echo comes back from the walls of the so-called temple. Then it comes to a standstill. Ezekiel gets out of the space shuttle, and of a sudden a glittering being appears again, one of the strangers, and he says to Ezekiel, "Oh humans, you have eyes to see, but you see nothing, and you have ears to hear, but you hear nothing." And then the man in glittering suit gives Ezekiel a measuring device and orders him to measure this whole building, the so-called temple. Ezekiel, in the meantime, he understands that this has nothing to do with God. So he has courage. He asks back to the glittering man, "Why? Why should I measure this temple?" And the other one says, "That's the reason why we brought you here, humans." So Ezekiel starts to measure length and wide and how many stairs, etc. All this you can read in the Bible, all the measurements of the so-called temple. Now in Germany, we had a German engineer, his name is Hans Herbert Bayer. And he read these measurements and he asked himself, is this a true building or is it just imagination, fantasy? Because the theologians say this temple, this building is a future temple in a future Jerusalem. But the German engineer wanted to know, is this a real object? And he started to calculate exactly according to Ezekiel's measurement. And out comes a building which looks today like a stadium, like a football stadium. And then this German engineer came to me and I saw his calculations, absolutely precise. I asked him, have you ever heard of NASA, of Mr. Blumrich's reconstruction? Because NASA did only reconstruct the splendorness of the highest, which means the shuttle, while the German engineer was only reconstructing the so-called temple. So one have the splendorness of the highest and the temple. So I brought the two men together, the German engineer and the NASA engineer. And the space shuttle fit perfectly into the temple by every centimeter. The so-called temple was nothing else but the base station for the extraterrestrial shuttle. They had to come to a standstill, they had to repair it, they have to do something. And we have definitely a proof of all this. And here, at least for me, something is very, very important. You see, when you read the Bible, just as a normal people, you read, and the temple will be so and so long, the temple will be so and so large, will be so and so high, etc. Will be means future. But the original Ezekiel has nothing written in the future. I know the original, I translated it myself. In the original he says, the building is so and so long, is so and so large, etc. How can this future, this form and grammatic of the future? The theologians believe that Ezekiel had a vision of the Almighty God. And the Lord now shows him a future temple in the future Jerusalem. Now the Semitic language, the original Semitic language, has no vocals, has no A, E, O, U, has only consonants. And you simply put these vocals in it. Now, because they believe that Ezekiel is talking about a future temple in the future Jerusalem. They have translated the Ezekiel in the form of the future. The temple will be so and so long, will be so and so long. In reality, it's all present. The temple is so and so long, is also. The temple was nothing than the landing base for the extraterrestrial shuttle. Imagine there is a group of humans working as slaves for the Babylonian on a river with the name of Chebar. A group of extraterrestrials is watching them, learn their language. The group of extraterrestrials came down. They know in the meantime which human is the leader of this group. It was Ezekiel by profession. He was a high priest in the temple. They took him and brought him on a very high mountain in a far country, very high mountain far away. They give him the order to measure the building, and then they bring him back to his own people. Now his people will ask, hey, Ezekiel, you are back again? Wonderful. We were afraid of you. What have they done to you? Have you been hungry, thirsty? And Ezekiel is very, very happy. He describes his first flight. And he describes he had to measure a building. He says, here are the measuring dates. Here. Why should extraterrestrials do things like this? They knew exactly. Ezekiel and his society believe that it has to do with the real Almighty God. And because Ezekiel had the chance to be taken away by the real Almighty God, such a description will not just be thrown away. Such a description becomes holy. Such a description will enter into the holy books of mankind. The extraterrestrials know that, of course, humans will have wars throughout the history. They will fight against each other, but the holy texts will remain because they are translated in many, many languages. They knew this. They knew again, in a far future, the human race will have the capability to fly themselves. They will read this old text of Ezekiel and they will say, come on, this is not God. This is technology. And again, we have the temple. We can reconstruct these things because of the measuring days of Ezekiel. They will come to the conclusion, the one conclusion which I said here. It was not God. It was simply the space shuttle of the extraterrestrials. All what we have to do now, or our science had to do now, is find the temple where Ezekiel was. He was on a very, very high mountain. And I have a possibility of such a temple. In South America, in Peru, 3,800 meters in the Andes, is a temple which archaeology does not understand. The temple is called Chavín de Huántar. Chavín de Huántar has no starting point. It was promptly here. We have no idea of the culture of Chavín de Huántar, because every culture has a development. A culture is not just here. It starts slowly, but the temple of Chavín de Huántar does not fit into the development of a culture. Also, on the walls of the temple of Chavín de Huántar, you found strange heads who look absolutely strange. Some of them have helmets on. And then you find some engravings of winged beings. In archaeology, they call it winged geniuses. Winged beings, done so precisely. Ezekiel describes when he was brought on this very, very high mountain. He said, they come down to the so-called temple. The temple was nothing but the base camp of the extraterrestrial. And he saw on the wall, I saw some heads and figures and some winged creatures on the wall. And in Chavín de Huántar, we find these winged creatures. And archaeology does not know who started Chavín de Huántar. Simply not because he was the extraterrestrial in that case. They needed on Earth a base camp. You see, when our scientists, our mountain climbers, they go to the Himalaya, you don't make it in just one line. You need base camps, stop by stop. So extraterrestrials needed something like this too. And one of these base camps was Chavín de Huántar. And Ezekiel was brought up there, and he writes about it. Today we find the temple. We see these winged creatures, etc. It all makes perfect sense.